do you think leaders then, two of them, in fact, not just Chairman Mao, but also President Nixon, had the vision that enemies actually could become partners? How could they be able to do that?
Well, I think at the time there was a widespread understanding, I think, in both our countries, that we had common purpose and common interests, and we had waited too long to realize the benefits of cooperation. So as Richard Nixon and Mao Zedong approached each other, they were working from a foundation which said we should cooperate. We have too much in common. Indeed, neither country thought the other was their primary adversary, and of course we all know that a common interest against the Soviet Union was that initial bond that brought them together, such an important element of the back-channel talks between Kissinger and Prime Minister Zhou Enlai. And once the Chinese side could see the United States receding from Indochina, taking away that threat to Chinese border security, well, then the obvious benefits of cooperation brought the two together.
It's very interesting now. Even when we're talking about it, I still have goosebumps because it was really exciting time. And you think about what that decision then has meant now. It's really tremendous. Do you think the leadership now between the two countries would have much vision as then our two countries had?
I think, of course, the leaders of that time, both of the side have great visions, very clear. But today, I think the problem is, from Chinese perspective, I think Chinese leaders still have vision, but the U.S. politics is a problem because they changed the president, changed the ruling, from different parties at least. So bring in the different visions, this is a problem. And also the environment of the leaders in both countries, I think, are different comparing with the past. Now the decision-making environment is much more complicated comparing with 45 years.
Right.
There was no Twitter, there was no, actually in China, no TV, no audience, no such a mass media. So I think today the leaders are facing a very, very difficult environment to make big decisions.
Well, I'm not sure as a media person whether media is an obstacle or rather a facilitator for better relations. I have an argument with you over there, Professor. But repair relations between the United States and China then is never easy. Even for President Nixon from the US, his attitude toward China was not, quote, good in the very beginning. That's at least the belief here in this part of the world. Nixon, during his 1960 presidential campaign, he had supported then Taiwan leader Chiang Kai-shek. By the second half of the decade, he increasingly began to talk about there being no reason to leave China angry and isolated. And then that developed into 1971. Nixon specified 5 great power centers, including US, Europe, Soviet Union, Japan, and also China. And by the way, Mr. Da, I heard that Chairman Mao Zedong, after reading that specific speech given by Mr. Nixon talking about 5 powers, including China, decided there is something that could be done. So messages are extremely important.
Sure.
Media is important in that regard. But anyway, let me come back to you about that point. What about messages? What kind of messages? How to send those messages? What would be the best platforms for those messages?
I think, sending messages at that time is different because that's, the Nixon breaking the ice of the US-China relations was a typical secret diplomacy. So nobody know the development before Dr. Kissinger visited China. So that's a really secret
Even
diplomacy.
after that.
Yeah, but today it's different. So sending signal become more difficult today. So it's very hard to imagine such a secret diplomacy between the US and China today. So I think today, in today's environment, I think sending signal become more and more, something public.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Professor Ross, do you agree? Is it about the sending signal and the challenges related to that, or something else?
Well, I think Da Wei is right to say the first issue is one of vision and where we take the relationship. And I would agree with him that the Trump presidency has yet to establish its direction. But many Americans are concerned because we're not sure what the Chinese vision is either. We hear about the China dream, and it's quite clear that a large navy is part of the Chinese dream. So Americans are apprehensive about where the Chinese want to take the relationship. In this context, it's important to remember that when President Nixon said there were 5 powers, well, there were really only 3, right? There was the United States, China, and the Soviet Union. Well, today in Asia, there are only 2. And of course, that makes the relationship far more difficult. When President Nixon traveled to China, our common focus was the Soviet Union. Today, when we do U.S.-China relations, our focus is each other. And there's no way to get around that fundamental contradiction in East Asia that the United States and China are the 2 great powers.
Professor,
When President Nixon went to Beijing,
Professor,
yes.
what you said, extremely interesting and thought-provoking. That's why I want to follow up a bit, because it has never happened, China, United States being the biggest world economic power and the second largest world economic power. And China has no apprentice being the world's number 2, when it comes to economic power at least. While the US has already some experience for decades being the world's number 1 economy. For example, against the former Soviet Union, and in its interactions with Japan. So many here in China also wonder whether US has already got a lot of experiences dealing with number 2 and drag, quote unquote, the number 2 down. And exactly what China is facing from the United States, is that what it is?
I would frame the problem a little differently. I think you're absolutely correct that as China, its experience as being a number 2 or even a shared great power in a 2 great power system, it's a new experience. And so for the Chinese side, it is a learning process of how one uses one power in a way that doesn't destabilize or challenge others or create concern. On the American side, this is also a new experience in how we deal with a rising power that challenges American security in a very robust way. So the United States has to learn how to respond to a rising power, and this is new to the United States as well. I would suggest the answer for both sides is we both need to try and exercise restraint.
Wow.
And if we can both exercise restraint on the Chinese side, how it uses its power, on the American side, how it responds, the relationship can be more cooperative and less competitive.
Look at those footages, really impressive days. Both Chairman Mao's time and also President Mr. Deng Xiaoping, a paramount leader in China. Mr. Da, you want to respond to what
Sure.
Professor Ross just illustrated?
I think we should not be so pessimistic. I think so far China and the U.S. has done our job, maybe not very bad. Mr. Ross said that China is challenging the U.S. in security robustly, but if we look back to the history, actually the U.S. faced the Soviet Union's challenge. I think that was much serious, challenge for the United States. But today, I think China and the U.S. on security side, there are tension, but it's okay. And I think what we are better than the Soviets is we have very strong economic tie, and we also have very strong people-to-people tie with the United States. So we do have some differences, we do have some tensions, but I think China and the U.S. now are, in China's term, so-called new model of the great power relationship.
Right.
It is something new. It's different from Soviet-U.S. relations. It's different from the history of before the World War II.
Mr. Da, can China do well in the apprentice role of being the world's number 2 economy? Can China and the United States be able to afford now any mistakes in some of the crucial areas?
I think we can, but we need to avoid some, very important. We should not make any miscalculation on key issues.
Illustrate, please.
Yeah. For instance, we should not. China should not try to challenge the U.S. The commitment to the regional alliances, and China should not try to push the U.S. out of the region militarily and also diplomatically, economically. I think now we have a very good condition to avoid that strategic miscalculation. We have economic interdependence.
Okay.
We have nuclear deterrence to each other. So I think it's a good, environment for us to avoid the calculation. Well, on the U.S. side, they also need to avoid making any miscalculation about China's intention.
Okay, before we go to Professor Ross, let me just go with you through some specific points of history in which China and United States actually has been on some quite difficult times, ups and downs in the past 4.5 decades. Before we move on, take a look at these key historical moments.
In the joint communique on the establishment of diplomatic relations, U.S. President Jimmy Carter grants China full diplomatic recognition. The U.S. reiterated the Shanghai Communique's acknowledgement of the Chinese mainland's One China policy. Soon after that, Chinese Vice Premier Deng Xiaoping visited the United States. Due to political turmoil in Beijing in 1989, the U.S. government suspended high-level official exchanges and military sales with Beijing. A number of economic sanctions were also imposed. Relations got better in the next decade. Chinese President Jiang Zemin visited the United States in the fall of 1997. Following the visit, U.S. President Bill Clinton visited China in 1998. He traveled extensively in the Chinese mainland and had direct interaction with the Chinese people, including live speeches and a radio show. President Clinton signed the U.S.-China Relations Act of 2000 in October, granting Beijing permanent normal trade relations with the United States and paving the way for China to join the World Trade Organization in 2001. In April 2001, a U.S. reconnaissance plane collided with a Chinese fighter and made an emergency landing on Chinese territory. After this tense standoff, President George W. Bush kept stable relations with Beijing for more than 7 years. China and the U.S. have worked together on several global issues. Their joint statement on climate change set the foundation of the Paris Agreement, and they have become important trade partners to each other. But due to President Barack Obama's rebalance to the Asia-Pacific, Sino-U.S. disputes over the South China Sea have escalated.
Professor Ross, we mentioned about the history. Every moment of it is exciting, even to look back through footages. Professor Ross, can we afford any mistakes being made on key areas? Do the two administrations understand the importance of it and the skills of it?
To answer your first question, can we afford mistakes? The answer is no. This is a very delicate relationship, a very important relationship to East Asian stability and economic progress, and each mistake has the potential to contribute to a downward spiral. Each side must try and focus on what the sources of stability and cooperation are and find space for both countries to compete, to have security in East Asia.
Yeah.
This has been difficult. There's no question this has been difficult over the last 5 to 10 years, and will continue to be even more difficult.
So what can U.S. do?
This just creates greater pressure on both of our leaders. Well, what can we do? The answer is what I suggested before. There needs to be restraint, patience on both sides. On the American side, we need to be restrained in how we respond to the rise of China, to give China a voice and give China space in East Asian security.
All right.
But on the Chinese side, China has ambitions, and China has to realize these ambitions over time, not to try and achieve them overnight, so that there's time for both sides to adjust, to get used to each other, to find a new relationship. And that will be difficult.
Find a new relationship, it sounds exciting, but at the same time, definitely challenging. Mr. Da, your final words.
I think
it is a challenge.
Yeah, Mr. Da, your final words.
Yeah, my final words is I think now the U.S. and China, we are entering a new phase. You know, in the history, we have negotiation, we have confrontation, but today, how can we define the U.S.-China relations? I think this is a moment that we need a new definition, we need understanding of the nature